Good evening, everybody. Welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. Very happy to be with all of you tonight. It has been yet another super intense week, and I have to say, I look forward to our Thursday night gatherings as a way to be in community and have conversations that feel really important and relevant to this moment. Please, everybody, say hello in the chat box. Make sure to chat to everyone. We love to know who's with us in the room. Let us know where you're coming from. You can also add your questions in the chat, and we will try to bring them in later in the program. A few words about JWA for anyone who is new to us. We are a digital archive. We work to expand and transform the way that we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We also pay special attention to how gender functions in the past and the present. And we do all of this work because we believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story will help us create a better world. So thank you for being our partner in that. The book talks are just one piece of JWA's work. I hope that you will go on to check out jwa.org and explore the full range of projects and resources that we offer. A very quick logistical note, if you would like captioning, there is a button that says CC or show captions. You can click that to turn them on for yourself. Okay, I am delighted to welcome our featured author for this evening. Rachel Somerstein is a journalist, researcher, and the author of Invisible Labor, The Untold Story of the Cesarean Section. That is the book we'll be discussing tonight. It is a wonderful book. It blends memoir, reporting, and history to better understand her daughter's birth and to explore the state of maternal care in the U.S. And in doing so, Invisible Labor examines some of the most entrenched social, technological, economic, and structural problems in the US, including the financialization of medicine, the medicalization of birth, structural and systemic racism, and a widespread disregard for women's autonomy and women's pain. And we will get to talk about many of those things. Rachel's reporting has appeared in the 19th, the Boston Globe, the Guardian, the Washington Post, and Women's Health, among other publications. As a researcher, she has published widely on photojournalism, representation, and collective memory. She holds a PhD from Syracuse University and an MFA from NYU, and she is an associate professor of journalism at SUNY New Paltz. Rachel grew up in New York City, where she attended a Jewish day school, and she joins us tonight from the Hudson Valley, where she lives with her family. Welcome, Rachel. So glad to have you here with us
Thank you
tonight.
so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
So let's start with you giving us a little taste of the book, if that's good for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this is from the beginning of chapter 3, and the title of the chapter is The Origins of the C-Section. And I think one thing that this chapter does that's important for the book is that it makes connections with the past and the legacies that I inherited as a Jewish person, and also that Black women have inherited as a consequence of slavery. So I'll just leave it at that. Growing up, my parents kept a tarnished tin cup hanging over our kitchen sink. We used it to perform a ritual hand washing on Shabbat and Jewish holidays. It had belonged to an American soldier. He gave it to my grandmother at my father's bris in a displaced persons camp in Germany in 1946. The soldier's cup is emblematic of the shadows I grew up lugging around, of all the people in my family who didn't make it out of Europe, whom Nazis shot in the street or gassed at Belzec. My uncle, my grandmother's firstborn, my grandfather's brothers, his parents, cousins. This past shaped how I saw the world and my place in it, my responsibility to my family to make something of myself as the only daughter of the only son to survive in our family line. I found myself thinking about this history often in the months after my daughter's birth. On the one hand, I reasoned, I was epigenetically prepared to withstand suffering and to survive it. Other times I wondered if I hadn't inherited some divine curse that had tumbled down the generations of my family. Maybe I thought I had been destined to suffer. Perhaps only by invoking the past could I metabolize how something so brutal could happen in a shiny 21st century American hospital. Regardless, I was onto something. Whatever past we think our society has definitively left behind probably isn't past at all. It's ever present. The scholar Marion Hirsch uses the term post-memory to describe atmospheres like the one I grew up in. Post-memory, she writes, characterizes the experience of those who grow up dominated by narratives that preceded their births. Hirsch's concept helped me to understand my own life. Working on this book, I wondered if it might apply to contemporary obstetrics too. Though it has been revolutionized by technology and modern understandings of germ theory, obstetrical history, its development on enslaved, impoverished, disabled, and othered women, continues to shape the contours of contemporary obstetric practice, and cesareans in particular. Moreover, as measured by the conversations that I had with Black women, this past is not past at all. Obstetrics development on enslaved women came up in nearly every conversation, even if we didn't set out to talk about the past. In that sense, obstetrics is but one area in which all of us, doctors, patients, no matter what ethnicity, are living with what scholar Saidiya Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery. Alicia D. Bonaparte, a Pitzer professor of sociology who shared Hartman's ideas with me, noted how very embodied the afterlife of slavery can be, from police use of deadly force to the ways that missing women of color rarely make the news. Quote, your lived experience as a Black person is a reminder of the fact that you are not even considered as a human, but as a body. Understanding this present afterlife of slavery requires looking at the development of C-sections. And that story requires two looks, one that's straight on, relaying the story as it unfolds in the historical record, the other from the side, with attention to what wasn't recorded and whose stories went untold. Such an approach to the past shows that this operation, though at its core meant to save both mothers and babies, has never been as simple as that.
Thank you, Rachel. Um, I was really moved by that passage because I feel like it speaks so much to our approach to history at JWA, which is that it is, often people think, okay, history, it's interesting, it's nice, we should know where we came from, sure, but don't have a sense of it as being essential and being
Yeah.
something that is really shaping our daily lives in the present and how we feel, how we show up, how we shape our communities, what are the kinds of structural um, beliefs that we have about ourselves and about others, and also things that obviously shape the systems that we're part of. So I felt like that was a really important way of framing it. And then of course also it's a very personal piece. It's like it's the big piece, and then it's also about sort of like how we can't do anything except for show up as the people who we are, who come from very particular circumstances that shape our response to everything. So um, that encapsulates so much that feels very much at the core of your book. And I wanted to ask you, obviously it speaks to all these very big themes that we'll talk about, but also like tell us where the book started for you and at what point you knew you were going to write write this.
Sure. And I should say, just to the point of the past and the present, I mean, I feel like I reflect on that so much. I'm interested in that. I've always been interested in that, right? Like just, I don't know, as a fact of my intellectual interests. But I feel like I reflect on that now as a parent, and I see my kids growing up in the Jewish community. And it's like, oh yeah, you're like surrounded by like the past everywhere, like the Yortzeit, things that are lit up, right? And the kids asking about that, or even just like the idea of Kaddish, right? I'm like, of course, it's like inevitable. Then I feel that I became interested in the past and how it shapes the present. But
Mhm.
where the book came from was when my daughter was about 2.5. Before she was 2.5, I realized how badly the birth had hurt me, and I contemplated finding legal representation to sue the hospital. And by hurt me, I mean like psychologically, right? Physically, I'm fine. My daughter's fine, but I realized it had really left a serious mark. And I couldn't find anybody who thought that I had a case because it was only like a psychological harm. And that's actually starting to change, which I think is important. And there's lots of consequences to that, both good and bad, right? And in realizing that what this was like a dividing line in my life, I was like, oh, I want to write about this. Like, I'm a writer. How could I write about anything else other than this? And at the time, I was also working on this other project, and I put that project, like I literally was at my desk, I opened the drawer, I put that other manuscript away, and I it was 11 o'clock in the morning, and I was like, okay, I'm done for the day. That was the biggest thing, was to decide, no, this is the project with stakes. This is the project that matters. And once I started doing some more research into C-sections, I was like, oh, there's like so much here that is far, it's about what happened to me and understanding that, but there's so much more to say about America,
Hmm.
and about everybody's experiences in maternal care. And the past, excuse me, the past plays such an important role in the ways that people have access to midwives, for instance, or don't. People have access to physicians or obstetricians or don't. That it felt almost like walking into a project that was like designed for me. You know what I mean? Like not just because it had happened to me, but because of the questions that it enabled me to answer.
Yeah. Um, there's so much that you unpack in this story, about how sort of overdetermined birth is. Like you can use birth to talk about all these different things, and in part because there is so much that is layered onto it about, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a good mother, what a good birth is, what we're allowed to want, what we can control, all those
Totally.
kinds of questions. And so much of it, even as there's all these things that are determining it, also gets put on this kind of sense of individual responsibility, which is understandable because I think that's a natural instinct, in part because we live in a capitalist environment that wants everything to be about like what you can choose for yourself. But also, I think like on a human level, there is a tendency to want to think about that because that's what we can control. If it can give us a sense of like I can everything else out there is too much, but like I can control my own response or reaction. And then of course, bodies are not really controllable. And this was something that I wrote about in my own dissertation was about like what happens when feminists frame things as the control over our own bodies, but we're talking about bodies which can't really be controlled. And of course, what it means is self-determination, but then of course it gets mis kind of interpreted into being just about choice.
Mhm.
And so much has been defined around those terms.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you saying that because I think this focus on the idea that we have choice, I mean, it's important to some extent we have choice. And the idea that we have individual control is it's like, to some extent we do, right? You could like, decide to take the birth class or not take the birth class. And yet that also sort of obscures a greater reality, which is like these systems are what shape birth. And, to this point today, I saw this study that had come out that said nurse staffing levels are associated with um, C-section rates. So in hospitals that are staffed according to the national standards for nurses during labor and delivery, the C-section rate is 11% lower. And that's a systemic thing, right? It's not about like, I made my birth plan and I was like in charge and that's just completely out of your hands as a patient. And I think the more that we can see the impacts of these systemic forces, the more we can also sort of give ourselves um, I don't know, an easier time, right? Of just like, there's so much I can't control. And not in a way that's like scary, well, it's totally out of my control, but just to forgive ourselves, right? There's no way that you could do anything about that. You could choose to go to a certain hospital or not, if you even have that choice, right?
Right. Right.
But it takes it off of your back,
Yeah.
you know?
Right. But there are also certain ways that women are made to feel by all people that like we should have control over that. Like I did not have I delivered my children by C-section. I did not have a traumatic C-section, but I felt a lot of guilt. Like I have twins. My daughter was breech, my son was transverse. The doctor was like, I am not allowing you to labor. Now, we can also understand systemically, like she didn't know how to flip the babies because no one knows how to, most OBs don't know how to flip babies anymore. I went to an acupuncturist who can flip babies, but I went too late, probably, as I was told, which I then, of course, felt bad about. And there were other people who were saying to me, like, oh, well, did you try to flip them? Did you do? And I was sort of like, but I also like my birth was very technologically involved from the beginning because I conceived through IVF. So by the time I got to my birth, I was like the idea that I would be supernatural about it, supernatural, that I would be very natural about it felt already like so far away from what I could possibly have encountered. And so it was really interesting to me as I was reading your book to think about, you had this very traumatic experience of feeling a lot of pain during your C-section and then like basically have an anesthetized surgery, which is horrifying. Um, for me, that piece wasn't traumatic, but it also leads to lots of other things like trouble nursing and other things that were very traumatic for me. So it's like so interesting to see also this kind of the way that all of these different systems play in.
Totally. And then, and then they compound, right? Feeling into like it's like my fault, like, oh, I can't nurse, right? Like, oh, I can't, it's not going well. Oh, I can't pick up the baby or like the car seat or these things, these images I had in my mind of what it meant to be a good mother and
Right.
what postpartum life would be like, which are completely unrealistic no matter how you have a baby, right? Because you're taking care of a new person and recovering your own energy, right?
Right.
But you can feel doubly like, oh, I'm really messed. Oh man, I really didn't get this right. It's my fault. I messed up. And that, in talking to so many moms, causes a lot of, like you're talking about, like feelings of guilt and shame and isolation. And I think that that's also related to the ways that, C-sections are talked about or not talked about in the culture, right? And their history and who they were practiced upon, but also like to the extent if a person is not having a super medicalized pregnancy, when are people even learning about C-sections, right? Like if they're not expected potentially to have one, sometimes it's like when you're on the way to the OR. And so that also is very isolating. Like that's something that we can change and do a better job of. Um, and I think, prenatal education is super important for that.
Right. So you titled the book Invisible Labor, and I was thinking about that question about like the unseen and what is hidden. And so where did you see like what pieces were you thinking about as unseen or invisible in this narrative?
So I think like the actual surgery is really unseen. And there's that really interesting tension between when you look if you've recovered, right, and you look on the outside, there's like a little scar. And it's called the, bikini cut, right? Because it's like
Hmm.
low. And it seems like not a big deal. And we don't and it's also not that visible in the public culture, right? Even though it's 1 out of 3 births. So when I've talked to other groups and I do slides, I show them like if you Google, first of all, if you do like a Google image search for birth or you look at Getty Images, for stock pictures of birth, I don't even know if any in the first kind of hits, if any images of C-sections come up, which just doesn't
Hmm.
make sense numerically, right? Like they're one
Right.
out of 3 births. So they're not really visible. And then I think that the really the labor of them is not visible and not respected. The way that we treat them as like it's no big deal. It's just this little, and it's like, well, first of all, I mean, it's organ surgery, and
Right.
then you're taking care of a baby, even if you need it. Like I also want to be totally clear, like C-sections save lives, and thank goodness we have safe ones. And we should respect them for that, right? So I think that the mothers become invisible. What it does also to your future reproductive life is not visible. And what's so interesting to me, and that I've been interested in for a while, is things that seem to be everywhere, like they're ubiquitous, but they're really underlooked.
Hmm.
Right. And that I'm like, that's C-sections. Why don't we want to look at them? What does that reveal? And then when we do look at them, maybe they show us things we don't want to know, like the fact that they were practiced, on enslaved women, the fact that this is coming out now, the rates of pain during C-section vary very widely, but they're between 7% and 20% of births, depending on the institution. Not all of them are horrible, horrible pain, but there's pain. And it's like, why looking at that should make us uncomfortable, right? We need to do something about this. And that's, thinking about like invisible labor, I think casts that light, right? On like, let's look. And as a Jewish woman and that section that I read from in terms of being descended from Holocaust survivors, I feel like that's my mandate. Like, here's the thing that's ubiquitous that we're silent about, we don't want to talk about. And it is my mandate to be like, let's talk about it. Let's look at it.
Right. Yeah. Right. And there's so much research now we understand that like the things that aren't acknowledged are actually the things that become so much more traumatic. Um, as opposed to sort of sometimes I think the instinct is, and we know historically this happened certainly with the Holocaust and with many other things, like there's a fear that if you acknowledge it, it becomes more real and you have to acknowledge that it happened and could happen. And so there's this desire to not talk about things, but that actually that like compounds the trauma in so many ways.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
I was thinking also a lot about women's pain as being part of what's invisible, in not just in terms of C-sections, but in terms of, you know, how it figures into birth overall, the ways in which and women's health overall, that like women's pain is sort of disregarded or seen, certainly in the case of birth, as sort of beside the point. Like if you end up with a healthy baby, why does it matter?
Hmm.
Or also not acknowledged if it's not expressed the right way, right? Like people can only see pain if it comes in ways that they expect to see it, and that there isn't a lot of listening. And that's where maybe it's less about invisible than unheard or something. It's a,
Hmm.
a slightly different metaphor, I guess. But I was thinking a lot about that piece about pain, which you write about in a lot of detail in the book.
Yeah, and it's sort of astonishing, right? The degree to which from childhood we undercredit girls' pain, and that lasts like as you grow up, right? And even, just the ways like think about the ways we talk about menstruation and periods, it's like it's also diminishing. And I'm not suggesting like we should be treating women who are in pain as if they're two delicate flowers they can't do, but it's like this is real. And maybe that could even be illness, right? Like in terms of like needing time to recover. And I'm thinking because I'm still recovering from, this winter season of many respiratory infections. So that's tremendous. We see that even with inserting IUDs, right? Like it's like 5% of women are offered pain relief. And so if we look directly at this, it's like, well, what is that telling us again about the position of women in our society? And then to your point specifically about birth, the fact that we don't want to acknowledge that you can be both happy you have a healthy baby and also in a lot of pain. And that the healthy baby part doesn't negate what you've gone through, whether it's physically or psychologically. And I think that we're in this place in the culture where it's like we're so polarized. I mean, that's like the most obvious thing to say, but just in terms of being able to hold two truths at the same time, two things can be true. I can love my baby. I can be grateful that she's here and she's healthy. And I can feel grief for what I experienced or was not able to experience for people who had like an unplanned C-section and really wanted to have a vaginal birth. Or I can feel, grateful that she's safe and also feel, the fact that I'm alive, that's the floor, right? I could, my experiences matter beyond mere survival. And that is what happens when you get this comment of like, well, at least you have a healthy baby.
Right, right. And I think that's related to something else that I thought was a really interesting piece that you write about, which is um, the shift in the history of cesareans from C-sections being about saving mothers to being about saving babies, and the shift to prioritizing fetal life over the mother's life. And you write about how, like, coming from our current political context, which is so steeped in like completely disregarding the life of the pregnant person and really only focusing on fetal life, it was hard to even believe that it could have ever have been different because we take it for granted that like the discourse is really focused on fetal on fetal life over the rights of women, basically fetal rights over the rights of women.
Absolutely, right? Like the mother's the wrapper and the baby's the candy, and then you throw away the wrapper, right? Like that metaphor gets thrown around by mothers, it gets thrown around by physicians, not in a way of like they think it, right? But that's the feeling. And I
Right.
think I've been thinking a lot about how, in some ways, okay, so first of all, there's what's going on in the culture, right? In terms of devaluing mothers specifically. I mean, the fact that we don't have a paid leave system devalues mothers, period, right? Um, and only recently, a motherless child, right? The days before formula was probably not going to survive. So even for that reason, the way of surgery was considered successful is if the mother survived. The baby survived and the mother didn't, it wasn't considered a success, which is a complete inversion to your point of now. Um, I totally just lost my train of thought. The other thing that we were thinking about, mothers' lives being valued, babies' lives. Oh, I was going to say that I think that although physicians, or I should say clinicians and mothers, we have the same goal, right? Which is like that the birth comes through well. I also think in some ways we have different goals, and that the mother's psychological safety, right, and the goal of the physician is to make sure that there's 100% neurotypical in the sense of like neurally intact baby, right? Like that, like at all costs. And that's their mandate. And then I think mothers are coming into it. Of course, you want to have a baby who's completely okay, but you need to be okay too. And so in some ways, we're at cross purposes, even though we're trying to do the same thing.
Right. And then that's also where the systems kick in. And someone mentioned this in the chat also, liability for damage to an infant is much different than, as you were saying, like there's really no recognition or very little of psychological harm or other kinds of harm for mothers. So in terms of just like thinking about the likelihood of being sued, there's a huge pressure um, to C-sections as opposed to trying for another kind of birth if there's any kind of question.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's real, right? I mean, the vast majority of obstetricians are sued during their careers. And think about how horrible that is. I mean, it's horrible, right? And what that will also mean for your future practice,
Right.
right?
I was thinking also about that question of sort of like how we think about the current context of reproductive politics and how this relates. And obviously, like in the last few years, we've been so focused on the loss of Roe, um, and I was just thinking a lot about how much people don't really understand that the process of making abortion illegal is wrapped up in the story of male doctors trying to discredit midwifery and take control away from midwives and medicalizing birth basically to kind of justify their own existence and create their own profession, basically. But the impact that then has on what birth looks like is really significant in terms of just losing all of the experience that midwives have of what a kind of more holistic kind of women's health might look like.
Yeah, and that the one of the solutions to the maternal mortality emergency and to the C-section rate, which like virtually every single academic medical institution agrees is too high, is to integrate midwives. And, when we got rid of midwives, which happened in early 20s through the 50s, we got rid of all of the knowledge, right? That I shouldn't say got rid of it, but it was rendered um, no longer legible, right? It didn't count any longer. And the fact is that there are practices for midwives that, if integrated, and also their support, right, and the holistic kind of support that they give, we have the evidence that shows that the outcomes are better for mothers and for babies across the world. So, I mean, yeah, to your point. But I just wanted to go back and say one thing also about the kind of the cross purposes thing, right, between physicians and mothers. I was thinking about, and also like the emphasis on the baby. We can even think about like the way things happen in the operating room, right? Like the mother, is there a warm blanket for her? How is the catheter inserted, right? Are you completely naked and there's people bustling around and like this is your birth? And maybe you feel modest and a little embarrassed that you're like totally naked in this busy place with all these people who are clothed and doing their thing. Why don't we have a system that's more attuned to the mother's experience where it's like, okay, I'm going to put this catheter in, you know, if you prefer, I can just put the gown up to your knees. And there are OBs who do this, right? This is like patient-centered care. It's totally possible. It's not any more costly. It's just about recognizing the mother and her experience and like the pain that that can cause, right? And the psychological pain that that can cause of like, I feel really, this is very embarrassing for me, you know?
Right. Right. I remember thinking that like it was driving me crazy that I couldn't see what was happening because the guard was up and I was just like, I'm gonna miss it. And like I just was like pestering my spouse the whole time, like, what's happening now? What are you seeing now? Tell me what you're seeing now. What's happening now? I can feel pushing and pulling, but I don't know what's happening. And it was just like very alienating from my own body.
Yeah, and it's like we have solutions to that, right? Which is like, if the physician is not able to do the play-by-play, that's why there should be a doula. And that the doula's job in the operating room, apart from the support person, right, is to be like, you want to know what's happening? Okay, so now there's this, and now they're doing this, and then asking the physician, if it's the practice of the hospital, can you lower the drape,
Right.
right, when the baby comes out?
Right. One of the quotes that I had like underlined and starred in the book came from P. Mimi Niles, who's an
Hmm.
assistant professor of nursing at NYU and a practicing midwife, who said, mainstream medicine does not speak to all the ways of knowing,
Hmm.
which I thought was beautiful. Can you say a little more about what that means?
Sure, I think that goes back to the conversation about midwifery, right? And also goes back to we haven't talked about this quite yet, but in terms of like the specialization of medicine.
Hmm.
Um, and so, if you go to your, I don't know, like gastroenterologist, you're going to be focused on one set of issues. But that might really, if you're experiencing digestive things, like maybe that's actually related to stress. And your gastroenterologist might tell you that, got to get a handle on your stress. They can't help you with that. You've got to go see somebody else. Or
Right.
maybe it's related to allergies. So you have to go see an allergist, right? And, it's like the body as a machine as opposed to this whole. And that I think is a mainstream medical way of knowing, is thinking of the body as these separate parts as opposed to something more holistic, which is what we see in China, traditional Chinese medicine, excuse me, or um, different kind of like Ayurvedic approaches. And also midwifery, right? Midwifery, the whole idea of it is about caring for the person as a whole and thinking about, okay, what's going on in the mother's life that's affecting her sleep? What's going on in the mother's life with her relationships that's affecting her stress? What's going on with the mother's life professionally that's affecting her nutrition? All of that is going to affect and shape the pregnancy and ultimately birth. And we have to address all of it in order to care for the whole person. And that the emotional support too matters throughout. It's not just about like get in the right position, get your pain medication, and have the baby.
Right. I was thinking about it also, like all of that, and then also in terms of sort of who or what is our sources of authority, right? So like you write a lot about technology and the kind of valorization of technology as the best or in many cases only way of knowing something. And of course, technology can be super helpful and can tell us things that we couldn't have known before, but it also can be wrong and can't be the only way of knowing things. And there's so much attention on like the fetal monitors and things that do give us some information, but sometimes that information is not helpful or is not, might be correct in that moment, but doesn't speak to the larger experience. But on the other hand, women are not often allowed to be experts on their own bodies, and their own self-knowledge is not trusted. And it is shocking to me how much that is still the case, because that was like that point was sort of the very beginning of the women's health movement, and the whole idea of like, why is it that we are treated like we are morons when it is actually our experiences, and why can't we be the experts on our own bodies? And things like our bodies ourselves grew out of that. Like we don't need a doctor to tell us how we're feeling. We can actually figure out a lot ourselves, and what we know to be our own experience has value and authority and import. And it is just crazy to me how much there is still a sense that women are not trusted to be kind of reporters of their own experience.
Absolutely. And that, there's the gender component of that. And then there's the technology component of that, like you said, right? And so, um, you know, the idea that technology is this objective authority and that it's that a person, especially a woman, is fallible, right? Compared to the technology, it's simply not always true. And if we look at not even just birth, but things like other conditions, you know, um, where we just don't know enough yet, right? That to trust what a computer would say or what a test would say. And we could see that certainly with the experiences of people who have long COVID, right? Or other autoimmune diseases. Well, the blood tests say you're fine, and you're like, I'm just not fine.
Yeah, I actually have long COVID, and I think there's that piece in terms of both like individual reports, and then also just the huge role that patient advocates are playing in things like long COVID to basically say we actually need to design the studies because we actually know what our experiences are and what the questions are and what, we might notice things about experience or hear it from other people that researchers might not think of. And sort of like
Absolutely, yes.
where do the most creative questions come from? Sometimes they come from the people who actually are experiencing the thing and can make connections that others wouldn't.
Absolutely. And that lived experience part, I think sometimes gets denigrated as like, well, it's subjective and it's just lived and you didn't go to school for it. But it's a multi, if you're thinking about designing research in a multidisciplinary way to solve a complex problem like long COVID, right? Or how to improve birth, why wouldn't you could think of lived experience as another discipline. Like, why wouldn't you have that? And one that's directly experienced what happens. So I feel like, there's a great article in the New York Times Magazine a few months ago now by Linda Villarosa about the endocrinological effects of chemical hair straighteners. And what was so great about that piece, I thought, was she was talking about the issue, the health issue, but she was also profiling the scientists who helped to do the research. And so many of them were Black women who came to the topic because they had had their hair straightened as girls, and they were like, there's something wrong here.
Right. This
And
can't.
it
Yeah.
can't be, yeah. And it's like, well, they had that lived experience to bring them to the question.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think so often, as we've said, like there's a gender component to it that like women's experiences are, you know, kind of shunted aside or disregarded. And unfortunately, there are many cases where there are particular things like long COVID that more women seem to have. And so then that kind of reinforces that, right? Like this must just
Absolutely.
be in your head. You're being overly
Hysterical,
sensitive, right? You're
right?
hysterical. Exactly, right.
Or it's anxiety, right? Um, and then also that I think reifies like the this distinction that's artificial between the mind and the body. It's
Body.
like
Yeah.
your mind's part of your body, and if you're having these disturbing physiological experiences, boy, aren't you going to feel anxious? You know?
Right, exactly. And I think that there's a lot of binaries like mind and body that we have to challenge when we have these conversations. And one of them is the idea of sort of like what's normal or what's natural. And Stephanie is saying this in the chat, that often there's a kind of like pathologizing of women's bodies and experiences, and as if these are not, kind of things that bodies are meant to do. On the other hand, um, there's also a lot of kind of centering what is considered normal in medicalized labor, even from just the case of like your labor is supposed to go at a certain pace, and if you're not, it's stalled. But like everybody's body's different and everybody's timing is going to be different. And if you're supposed to go by a curve, like the whole point of a curve is that there is a range and like that seems to be misunderstanding the whole way that those things work. But then you also write about the fact that like it shows up in midwifery too, these assumptions about the kind of normal patient versus somebody who is has other conditions or is not kind of seen as falling into that camp. Can you talk about how that plays out a little bit?
Sure. So, the scope of care for midwives is typically like low, what we would call low risk people. So people who probably don't have like a chronic condition, they don't have hypertension, right? They don't have, or hypertension of pregnancy. They don't have gestational diabetes. In some states, they can't take care of women who are seeking to VBAC, right? Or if they've had more than two C-sections, or if they've had two C-sections, right? So there's so many things that kind of can shunt you out of normal. And so on the one hand, it's appropriate that midwives are caring for the people in their scope of care, right? That makes sense. But on the other hand, as one of the midwives I talked to pointed out, it's like everybody should have the touch of a midwife. And that's what midwifery integration is, right? It's about teams
Hmm.
that are obstetricians and midwives. And I think that what ends up happening too is it's like you're like, well, we think about now also midwifery as something that's for this like white middle class female ideal who fits the idea of normal motherhood. This is what a normal mom looks like. This is how she dresses. This is what her body looks like. This is what her baby's going to look like. This is what her house looks like. These are the kind of places she shops. And that then gets like self-perpetuating in terms of like, okay, well, midwifery, I guess, really isn't for me. And the tragedy of that is that midwifery was dominated by Black women in the United States and immigrant women and Jewish women and Indigenous women. And now Black women are the ones who are least likely to be able to access it. And they also are the ones who are disproportionately afflicted with these like high risk things or riskier things, right? That like get them, shunted into obstetric care only. So, the future, I hope, right, is actually having like everybody having the touch of a midwife. If you're experiencing hypertension, yeah, you need to have an obstetrician who's helping you manage that. And why wouldn't you also not, why wouldn't you see a midwife who would be caring for you psychologically too, right? And socially and emotionally, and, potentially is able to be present to attend your birth, in a safe capacity, right?
Yeah. And who might bring different skill sets.
Absolutely. Absolutely, because they've been trained in a different way than their obstetric colleagues. That's why they're not doing C-sections, right? And instead, maybe that they're far better at facilitating vaginal birth, and maybe that's what you want.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and I think the issue of race is such a huge one here, as we talked about from the very beginning, with the excerpt that you read, and just how much of the way that we have both developed and conceptualized obstetric care is based on things that were done to, and not just done to enslaved women's bodies, but assumptions about like what those bodies were for and needing to like reproduction being like a huge value that women offered and offer. And in almost every aspect of birth that you write about in the book, conditions are worse for women of color. Um, because of so many different kinds of systemic issues. Can you talk a little bit about that and sort of how that, like why that is, why that is?
Yeah, so it's the saying is like it's racism, not race, right? So if you think about structurally, right, if you're growing up in a community that has more exposure to environmental toxins, and like fewer economic opportunities and worse schools, by the time you get to be pregnant, you've been, your health has been compromised, your economic opportunities haven't been as good, your social and educational opportunities probably haven't been as good as somebody who grew up in a neighborhood or community with more resources. And that's going to shape your pregnancy, right? And that's before you get pregnant. To say nothing of like, okay, well, just the experiences of everyday racism, right? Of going to a store. And I think about this, like I had this really wonderful colleague who moved to a different institution who is from the Dominican Republic. And she's kind of lightish skinned. And when she was in the DR, she was privileged based on her skin. And when she came to the United States when she was 18, so like people would start like locking their doors when they saw her walking in a parking lot.
Hmm.
And it was really it blew her mind, right? She's like, now I'm black.
Right.
And if you think about growing up with that and dealing with that all the time, right? But again, by the time you get to your pregnancy, how has that affected your health? And how will that continue to affect your health while you're pregnant? How do you feel safe or not in the hospital, the people taking care of you? And then in terms of the ways that midwives, were really pushed out of the profession, like we said earlier, like midwives are the ones who have typically they're associated with better outcomes and lower C-section rates specifically, especially if you're having a baby for the first time. And there's not enough midwives in the United States for anybody. Like 1 out of 10 births is with a midwife, and overwhelmingly every demographic group is like, I want to see a midwife, and there's not enough of them. But that gap is greatest for Black women. And then that means like, okay, so maybe they're having C-sections that with a different provider they wouldn't have had. And then that sets you up for a future C-section. And then later on, it actually makes it more likely you'll need a hysterectomy, right? Like it just, these things flow downhill. So, those are things that are working in tandem in terms of race. But I wanted to say one other thing, which I think is super interesting that's been mentioned to me as I was reporting, and it's not in the book, is if we were able to extrapolate white women who are, I'm sorry, Jewish women who are lumped in, right? If they identify as white with white women, what would we see? And there are a couple of people who've said to me, and this is, if I'm looking for somebody to try to do the study with, it's going to be difficult. That the right now the data is that like if you're Black, you're 3 to 4 times more likely to die during pregnancy. But that if we took Jewish women out, the idea is that Jewish women are also not treated that well during pregnancy,
Hmm.
that gap would be greater. It'd be more like 5 or 6 times.
Wow.
And I've heard, and again, this is not really in the book because it ended up sort of just not fitting, but I've heard stories from Jewish women who are just treated with total disregard. Like one Jewish mom who'd had a number of C-sections, she said that her doctor was like, we'll just treat you like it's a zipper and
Oh
we'll
my
just
God.
unzip you every time just outrageous. So I'm curious about that aspect too.
That's really interesting. Um, yeah, I mean, Jewish women are so prominent in the women's health movement, and I've thought a lot about that, like why that is. And I think it has to do with a few different things, including sort of education and feeling like one could access, sort of be able to push back to certain kinds of authority because of feeling like there's a certain amount of educational
Mhm.
privilege, and a certain kind of outspokenness and a certain kind of comfort with bodies, maybe. But I think also another factor that doesn't have to do with this, but might have to do with other kinds of Jewish women's experience with the doctors, is that I think Jews tend to trust doctors.
I
Like
agree.
we don't have a very negative association most of the time with doctors. And so that may be a factor in some ways of sort of maybe not challenging enough or asking enough questions because there's a sense that like doctors are the good guys, and so we want more of that. But I think also like so many of the kinds of dynamics around women's health are so infused with Christian ideas. I mean, just like you made reference before to IUDs, like the fact that we don't give people painkiller for inserting an IUD is insane. That would definitely not happen if it were happening to men. But also, I think it's because there's a sense of punishment, like,
A
oh, you
hundred
want
percent.
this. contraceptive, you want to
Yeah,
have
you're a
sex and
slut,
not,
right?
right,
Like
you're a
that.
slut, so
Yeah.
like it's gonna
Yeah.
hurt. That's your price for like wanting to have sex without getting pregnant. And then also I think some of the feelings around like, you know, pain during childbirth, like go back to ideas from Eve, right? This Christian idea that like you're supposed to suffer, and there's this sense that, I mean, I guess that's also in the Torah, but I think it comes out much more strongly in Christian ideology around just like how women are supposed to feel pain. That is our suffering for the original sin, and that's so baked in, we don't think of it as a Christian thing. It's just part of the assumptions. And so that will play out in ways that are, it's another part of the invisible piece, I think, that we're not aware of. Certainly doctors who are making these rude comments are not going around thinking, well, some probably are, but very few. Most of them are not going around thinking I am trying to, you know, push some kind of Christian ideology, but it's just part of our culture.
Yeah, it's the water that we're swimming in, right? All of us. And, I read about this in the book, but what was so meaningful to me when I was trying to decide what I was going to do when I got pregnant again, like how I would have my next baby, would I try to have a vaginal birth after C-section, or would I schedule a repeat C-section? My mom said to me, in Judaism, like the mother's life is more important than the baby's life. And I was like, really? And yes. And that's a total inversion, right? In terms of what we're seeing of fundamentalist Christianity that is saying no, there are no exceptions for abortion in any of these extreme cases. And we're putting mothers' lives at risk, and women are dying because they can't access safe abortion. I mean, I have to say, like, one thing that's sort of mind-blowing is I was writing the book, and as I was writing it, the people I was talking to were like, Roe is going away. And I was like, are you sure? And I mean, these are experts. They know more than I do. But it was like I couldn't conceive it, right? Not in the
Mhm.
sense of doubting them, but just like, what? No, really?
Right.
Really? And it's like, okay, look at what's happened since.
Yeah. And the Jewish beliefs and traditions and laws about mothers' lives over babies' lives are actually the basis for a lot of Jewish women, a lot of Jewish groups that are advocating, that are pushing back against Dobbs and saying this violates Jewish religious practice. This violates our religious practice by having rules that are like preventing abortion and forcing women to um, bear pregnancies that are going to be harmful to them.
Yeah, and that makes me feel so proud. You know what I mean? Like in this way of like, yeah, like what an incredible tool, right? To use religious freedom to like create and try to restore freedoms for everybody.
Yeah. One of the things that I thought was also really interesting that I learned from your book is that some of the hospitals with the lowest C-section rates are those that serve Haredi women, ultra-Orthodox women, for the reason because it's a community that really values like
Have lots of
having
babies.
lots of
Yeah.
babies, and you can't have that many C-sections in a row, and you're more likely to need C-sections if you've had one already, so or to be given them. So you can have more pregnancies if you don't have C-sections to begin with. And it is one of the ways in which I think you do a really good job in the book of like questioning a lot of sort of binaries that we might have about what is more natural or what is more feminist or whatever. And I don't we most of the time don't think, or at least I don't think about like ultra-Orthodox communities as having better options for women because they have, in some cases, fewer options for women. But in this case, there are a lot of things that are built in to support women's procreative potential, and I think there are a lot of things you point out that like religious communities provide in terms of support for mothers that can be very helpful and that are missing from secular society. And I think that that's one of the things that like we really have to be open to. Like, if we want to improve things, we have to be able to take things from places that might not be the obvious things that we think of as like being the most, you know, progressive or forward thinking or whatever.
Yeah, and I love you bringing that up because it makes me think actually about like the midwifery practices, right? So you could like look back at the things that people were doing in the 19th century and be like, oh, that's so backwards that the midwives would, put this balm on the woman's belly or like sing to her. And it's like, well, if it's not causing harm, and in some ways you could totally understand actually what it would do that's good, why would we just invalidate that or refuse to consider it? And so, yeah, the cynical way to look at some of these things is to be like, well, if your main role in your community is to have lots of children, of course your community is going to do what it takes to make that as pleasant as possible. And there are these Kimpaturan homes, which are, you just go and you sleep and people care for your baby and it's social if you want it to be. There's other new moms there, or you could just sleep. You don't have to socialize. And now we see that secular societies trying to implement that, with like the Borum retreat and a couple of other ones that are so insanely costly. They're absolutely out of reach for the average and even, upper middle class person. They're for a short period of time. They're about maximizing profit. And the reason they exist is because postpartum care is so lacking. So to, like you're saying, to look at these other systems and be like, okay, I don't have to be, it's not saying that I want to become Haredi or, but to reject and automatically assume everything they're doing is regressive
Hmm.
or unsupportive is it's cutting off opportunities for really like looking for change,
Hmm.
that works well. And if you think about it, I mean, I have two children. The idea when I learned about Camp Turan homes, I'm like the idea that I could have gone to a place and I could have slept, and sleep is the if you're having a postpartum mood disorder, that's like the first line treatment is make sure you're getting 5 hours of uninterrupted sleep a night. The fact that this exists and why wouldn't we want that? Right.
Right.
And in a way that's like affordable, right? That's meant to serve moms and families, frankly, right? Like your other kids too benefit, right? Your
Right.
spouse benefits.
Right. For sure. Yeah, and there's an important comment in the chat from Anya about like making sure that we don't overgeneralize. And I certainly want to point out, like, yes, Jewish women are a huge category, very diverse, lots of different experiences. I don't think we're saying at all that like all doctors are good, are bad, all midwives are good, for sure not. I think it's more about systems and like what the systems do. And there are certain, like you had a midwife for your first delivery and
It was
that didn't
terrible.
really didn't
Yeah.
help you, right? So it's
Yeah.
it's more about sort of historically what certain systems have been and what they are now and what we can learn. And I think exactly this point about like we have to be able to take the things that work in different places and mix it up a little bit better and be able to um, assess things. Recognize also that like it's not a one size fits all thing, right? Like everybody is going to have different needs and different um, pathways. And so like making sure that we're actually attentive to that and kind of looking more holistically and also more individually for like what a certain person feels they need. But that what that requires is actually listening to people, and also talking to them about it so they actually have a way of thinking about what it is that they need.
And
And
presenting all the options, right? That's what true informed consent is. Here are your this are positives, negatives, and alternatives, right, to a recommended intervention. Um, and I think one thing that happens sometimes in these conversations is it can sound like midwives good, doctors bad, right? Or like we did it better in the past. And I have a piece coming out about this, like reimagining the future of birth and maternal care. And in the piece, I say, like, I'm not suggesting we go back to the 19th century where women were dying in childbirth. When I was writing that piece, I had pneumonia the past month. Thank God there's antibiotics, and that cured me, and that I could go to the doctor and all of this, and they could measure my pulse ox, right?
right,
And the other thing that got me through is my community, right? The people who came and helped me with childcare, right? When my husband wasn't here, my friends who brought me food, right? The psychological safety that they made me feel trying to decide, do I need to go to the emergency department? I needed both. And that is the point of like, what does each person need, like you're saying, and where can we look for solutions across all different kinds of care to make sure each person is getting care that's humane and appropriate and listening.
right. Yeah. You have a beautiful story in the book about saying Birkat HaGomel after your daughter's birth, the traditional Jewish prayer that you say when you've survived something life harrowing, and how that helped you in a way that nothing else had yet. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, so I should say, I grew up observant and then I became not observant and I'm somewhere in the middle now. And I find myself like this is the same thing of like not, choosing what you need, right? Like I found myself needing to acknowledge in front of my community that I had gone through something really dangerous and scary. And when we did the baby naming, my dad led it and he led me in that. I had asked him to lead me in that bracha. And it was like, I didn't want to get up there and be like, look at my pain. You know what I mean? And I didn't want to get up there and talk about what had happened to me. And I probably couldn't have even talked about it. And I also wanted to mark this event that's about like recognizing my daughter's place in the world and the community. And as a Jewish girl, I wanted to also witness myself in that. And it was a small thing like at our house, and it was so powerful to be able to say that and to know that, especially for um, people who are Jewish who understand what that bracha means, like that could reverberate, I think, in a way that trying to explain an experience almost can't, right? Like it touches something so deep inside of you that is almost nonverbal. And I think that when it comes to, for me, with my births, but like I think birth in general, like we struggle to find language to talk about it. Good, bad, all of it. It's like so embodied, it's almost impossible to verbalize. And so, although that was obviously like words, there was something it like activated an embodiment thing, and it was a really important moment for me. And I also felt like for me, it was a connection between me and my dad that he really, I think, understood that and what it meant for me, for him to lead me in that.
Mm, that's really beautiful and such a reminder of like the role of how important ritual is and part of that whole question of like how do we actually listen to people and give them maybe different ways to express themselves than just like the most straightforward ones. Like maybe that's not part of what listening to people means is listening to them in whatever way they need to tell us what they need to say, which might not be in conversation, right? There might need to be other avenues of expressing that. And I think you write about touch also as a really important one. And so many rituals also are embodied in that way where it's about, you know, holding something or being held by your community or, coming up to the Torah or something where there's a different kind of way that you show up that might open something that's possible.
Yeah,
In
and it can feel like touching the past, right? And touching like the all of the people, all the women who've gone through childbirth, right? And all different kinds of circumstances, or all the people who've come up to hold the Torah, or, and it's about being witnessed in this way that's also nonverbal for all the people who are there too, right? For them, how does, reverberate for them? And I think about that even in terms of like, you say Shema with your community, how that reverberates differently, but probably quite significantly for everybody.
yeah, right. You also write about the concept of emplotment, which is a concept from the historian Hayden White about the process of creating a narrative from events. Um, and you talk about it. I think when you're writing about it, you talk about it in the context of like people telling their birth stories and how important that is. And that is, I mean, we know we even just see like in the chat, some people shared some pieces of their birth stories and just how powerful that is. My kids are 18 and there are still pieces I feel like I love to talk about and just to like repeat and explain and try to understand for myself. And I just want to say thank you because I think that your book really models this in a very beautiful way because you are showing how the personal is political and how you're telling your own story and you're telling it in a way that um, really looks at the whole picture and tries to teach all of us something about the world as it is and also ways that we could aspire to and work to the world being better. And there are so many things now that we need to be working on. But I think that it's very clear that this through line around women's health and rights and health and, the whole medical system is one where there are so many attacks right now and so many ways that this is shaping our lives. So thank you so much for modeling this for us and for
Thank
inviting us
you.
into this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really a pleasure. And I think, it can be so overwhelming sometimes, right? When we look at all the work there is to do, and it's like we just have to do a little part of it. And remember, there's so many people who are also doing a little part of it too.
Yeah. And keep learning from each other because each of us is has something to share and we can carry those things forward together. So I want to thank you, Rachel, for this
Thank
really
you.
important conversation. I
Thank
want to
you.
thank everybody who's with us for being with us here tonight. As always, there is a lot to discover at JWA that is relevant. So much more than I could possibly mention now or put in the chat, but I'll mention a few things. You can learn more about Jewish women in the American Women's Health Movement in our encyclopedia article on the topic. There also are a lot of specific women in our encyclopedia that are relevant. A couple are Dr. Lena Kanan, who was an OBGYN in the mid 20th century, who designed her practice to meet women's needs and did groundbreaking research on postpartum depression. Dr. Bessie Moses, who is a gynecologist and birth control pioneer in Baltimore. You can listen to an oral history on our site with Dr. Ruth Finkelstein, who was an OBGYN who worked in Bessie Moses's clinic. You can read a piece about a Dutch Jewish midwife's profession and see a piece of her birth register from the early 19th century in a piece in our From the Archive series. You can listen to a podcast episode about Our Bodies, Our Cells with one of its founders, Volunia Diskin. We also have an interview with some of the activists in Indiana who are working for reproductive freedom, reproductive rights there based on religious freedom, abortion rights based on religious freedom. I want to mention that Repro Shabbat, a Shabbat that celebrates reproductive rights, is coming up next month, February 21st to 22nd. JWA is proud to be a co-sponsor. There are lots of opportunities to gather around the country, so check that out. Tonight is the last book talk of our January series, but have no fear. We will be back in just 2 weeks with a new online history course on race, ethnicity, and gender in global Jewish experience. That begins on February 13th. I hope to see many of you there. We will also be announcing more book talks in March soon, so keep an eye out for that. And until next time, everybody, take care, stay safe, let's protect each other. Have a lovely evening and weekend. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good night.